We welcome all of you here. I'm Lynn Ames. I'm the current chair of Solutions Utah, and we're delighted to host this event, and we think we've got some very important and powerful speakers and presentations for you this evening to talk about critical issues as we move an inch closer to the next legislative session, and talk about some of the changes that are happening not only locally but nationally, and we've brought in some really good folks. We're deeply grateful to Grand America and their team for hosting us this evening. They're donating the space for us tonight, and so we're very grateful for them, and I hope they know that we appreciate that, and very nice to have these good accommodations for their assistance. We're grateful to Brian. Where's Brian? So Brian's over here, and Jan, raise your hand. So they're the two that have made this all happen and come together. For the most part, we're grateful for their work and service here for us tonight. For those of you that aren't that familiar with Solutions Utah, maybe I'll just take a quick minute and share a little bit about who we are and what we're about. We're an advocacy group here in Utah. Our name suggests that our issues can be pretty broad. We try to see issues in the state that we think maybe are places where we can help to bring some solutions and some ideas. It is our hope that we can bring some of the best minds in our state and in the country together to find the right kinds of solutions to challenges like homelessness. And we've taken on a few other issues as well, as some of you know, and we'll continue to identify issues where we think we can make a positive difference and a positive change. And certainly the cause of homelessness is an ongoing challenge for all of us, and it's a complex issue that takes a lot of minds and a lot of effort, and we think there's some ideas and movement in the right direction. We'll hear a little bit about that tonight, and there's more to come in the future. So we appreciate very much your being here tonight, and without further ado, I'm going to turn some time over to Brian, and he will introduce our first speaker, and we'll jump right in. But
thank you, Lynn. Well, we're very excited to have Devon Kurtz as our keynote speaker this afternoon. And just a little bit about Devon. Devon leads research and policy development in public safety and homelessness. His writings have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Boston Herald, City Journal, and The Hill. Devon holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Classical Studies from Dartmouth College and a Master's in Criminology from Homerton College, University of Cambridge. And today, Devon's going to take a few minutes and discuss, we'll be leading a discussion on how new federal homeless policies could impact Utah, and he'll probably have some other things he'll want to add in as well. So we welcome Devon.
Thank you so much for having me. The Cicero Institute is an organization that's based in Austin, Texas, actually. But I live here in Salt Lake, and I've been here for about a year and a half. But the origin story of the Cicero Institute actually begins in San Francisco. We were founded by one of the co-founders of Palantir, Joe Lonsdale. And I started with them in San Francisco. We had a beautiful office on Embarcadero. But we were surrounded by this national homelessness crisis that at the time we thought was the result of the uniquely poor governance of California, but we soon learned was a national tragedy. So we, as an organization, we moved to Austin in large part because of the failing policies of California and the challenges it presented us, and our inability to gain traction as a public policy organization in Sacramento. And we felt we would have a better chance at influencing policy for the better in a state like Texas. I think little did we know that Texas was also going to be quite challenging and that Austin was facing a comparable homelessness crisis. So we have spent the last 6 years around the country, in about 2/3 of the country, about a little over 30 states, helping state lawmakers push back on, at the time, this federal homelessness system that we saw as really preventing innovation, preventing states from changing their models to better fit the needs of their population. Instead, it was this one-size-fits-all that was required through federal funding, which made up the bulk of funding available for homelessness in the vast majority of the country. California, ironically, was probably the least dependent on federal funding. But for a state like Utah, or even more so for a state like Nebraska, federal funding was almost the entire spending that was happening. So we've been able to gain quite a bit of traction, and I would say in about a third of the country, with Utah included, we've seen states start to move in a different direction. And Florida, Georgia, Utah, all over the last couple of years have, in some way or another, moved away from housing first, the prominent model that was pushed by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development over the last 15 years or so. And I think it's important to help define what we mean by housing first. Because I think it is often this, sometimes it's a program, sometimes it's a philosophy. And I think it's important to emphasize that what we mean by that is a low barrier, voluntary only approach to homelessness that emphasizes the housing as a human right, rather than sort of an iterative program model that adapts to either the individual needs of the client or the needs of the community. So we've seen that in legislation by Representative Clancy and by others here in Utah. Governor DeSantis in Florida, Governor Kemp in Georgia have all made an effort at the state level to start to move in a different direction. But that had no effect on the federal funding that was kind of in parallel to the state efforts. So we've been able to build momentum for federal reform really from the bottom up, from changing what's happening at the states and then signaling to the federal government that change was necessary for the states to fully implement the directions that they were trying to go. And I think that the recent New York Times article about Utah, which I think was received perhaps poorly here, in my work was fantastic because it showed what I had been saying for really since the transition to the new White House began a year ago, that Utah is the center of this national story of moving in a different direction on homelessness. And despite some of the fiery rhetoric from some national organizations, that story was largely told by the New York Times. And in D.C., I can say that it was very well received, and it elevated Utah's attention and sort of confirmed what we had been trying to convey for some time. So I think that when we are thinking about the recent federal changes through the White House executive order in July, it's important to remember that a lot of what we see in that started with efforts here in Utah. And we could look back at last session and the resolution that Representative Clancy introduced calling on the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to make key changes that would allow Utah to go in a different direction. And that that effort was bipartisan. It was not only a Republican-led effort, but did in fact enjoy considerable support from Democrats. And Utah was not alone in doing that. Arkansas passed a similar resolution. Kentucky did as well. And it really made things quite a bit easier for the White House when they decided that they were going to act on long-standing criticisms of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's homelessness programs. And really they got a playbook delivered to them by Utah, by Arkansas, and through our work in various states to promote those ideas. So in July, we got that. We got this sweeping executive order that affected not only the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, but also went far beyond that. Also affected the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services. And I was thinking about this in terms of legislative session and our past work. Typically, when you sit down with policymakers as a think tank like ours, you present them with a bunch of options, and maybe they listen to 20% of it. The White House took everything we had and ran with it. I mean, they went even beyond some of the ideas that we had and created a framework that will transform how our country approaches homelessness, will unlock the potential of states like Utah to build even more momentum than they have been over the last few years, but also to allow different communities adapt to different needs. I think that more than anything, this really unlocks the laboratory of democracy and allows states to innovate which has been stifled for at least the last 15 years. So as far as what's in the executive order, there's a number of key points. I think the most notable and part of why we're discussing it here is the end of Housing First. But as I said before, what does that actually mean? What is Housing First? Well, in the context of the executive order, it's not that Housing First programs will no longer exist. That is not the case at all. They will. In fact, 30% of continuum of care funding will continue to go to Housing First projects under the executive order. What it means is that the Housing First mandate will be lifted, which is the requirement for all communities to participate in the Housing First model, to promote it as much as possible, to be incentivized through the funding mechanisms at HUD to adopt a Housing First model, and most importantly, not to adopt other models. That is what's being lifted. So about 70% of HUD homelessness funding will be free to be used for a wider variety of programs compared to the last 15 years. And these programs will be required to have some component that is either treatment-oriented or vocationally oriented, which is a departure from the Housing First model. But the idea is actually not to completely eliminate, I think there was a Politico article from a few weeks ago that described the executive order and some of the changes at HUD as a cut to homelessness funding, to Housing First. That's not what it's doing at all. It's simply saying that if you're currently receiving federal funding, you have to adapt your model. And the reality is, some number of providers are not going to be willing to do that. And in places like Seattle or Los Angeles, we're quite likely to see those organizations and those communities look at local funding, look at state funding to fill in the funding gaps where federal funding is no longer allowed. But for the vast majority of them, they're simply going to adapt their model to comply with federal standards. So this is where, again, it's ending Housing First sounds really ominous, but it's actually just a diversification of our approaches to homelessness. So the second piece of this, which is related, is a prioritizing of treatment for serious mental illness and substance abuse. And the key here is that they're prioritizing treatment for the most seriously ill. The vast majority of Health and Human Services programs, namely at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, have failed this cohort and have opted instead to support individuals who are well enough to agree to treatment. And this is framed, I think we saw in a MSNBC clip from Senator Plum a few weeks ago in kind of the wake of the New York Times article, this description of people have to choose treatment in order to succeed. And while I'm sympathetic to that, I think that the ethos behind the executive order and the evidence behind it is that actually there's a cohort of people who are too unwell to do that, even in the best of circumstances, that it's not a moral failing on their part not to accept it. It's actually a lack of capacity. And when there's that lack of capacity, we have to look towards court-mandated treatment. And this is a huge shift for U.S. Health and Human Services, which up to this point has been hostile towards involuntary treatment of every variety. We often think of it, strictly through the lens of involuntary inpatient hospitalization. That's a component. And the federal government actually has fairly limited levers to support that kind of involuntary treatment. It actually has far more levers to affect involuntary treatment that is outpatient. So court orders that would allow people to be medicated, but would also continue to live in some of the very housing programs that HUD is funding for homelessness. So there's this priority in the executive order to try to integrate those things. And Dr. McCants-Katz, who led SAMHSA in the first Trump administration, is a colleague of mine at the Cicero Institute. We're actually writing a piece right now about how the implications of this for Utah and why this is so important. I think when we look at the last 10 years, one of the things that is not discussed as much as it should be is that the proportion of the homeless population that is suffering from addiction and serious mental illness, their likelihood of being unsheltered versus being sheltered has actually doubled over the last 10 years. So we're seeing that it's actually more likely for homeless people who are struggling with these things to be on the street and not to be engaging in the Housing First services that we've been offering them. So that's what this second point of the executive order is oriented towards. The third point is enforcement. And this is a couple of different levers. The first is that there's some direct requests of the Attorney General, of A.G. Bondi, to have U.S. attorneys begin to enforce in earnest the federal crack house statute, which is a little-known part of federal law. It was passed in the 1980s to try to combat landlords that were unwilling to cooperate with the community and with law enforcement to protect the public from these buildings that were clearly overridden with drug dealing and drug trafficking and all of its associated ills. So the U.S. Attorney's offices across the country are going to be investigating violations of the federal crack house statute as it relates to homelessness. And that's a rare thing. It's a very powerful law. The penalties are very steep. For organizations, it's up to $2 million in fines. For individuals, up to $500,000 in fines, and up to 25 years in prison. It's a very, very serious law to break. And it's, however, very hard to prove. And it is also kind of a last resort. But it's important because of the excesses in communities that we saw in San Francisco, for certain, Los Angeles, the flagrant violations of the federal crack house statute by certain organizations. This is a way of, in addition to the funding streams changing, allowing the Department of Justice to apply additional pressure where there's especially bad actors. It's unlikely that will lead to a lot of prosecutions, but the very threat of it is enough to have changed the conversation in many of the cities where I work. The other piece of this is, in order to retain funding from HUD or the Office of Justice Programs and DOJ, or even the Department of Transportation or various Health and Human Services grants, communities must be compliant with the executive order standards for enforcement of open drug laws, of camping bans. These are things that are often already illegal in most communities, but have largely been left unenforced by law enforcement, by district attorneys' offices, and by judges. And if communities continue to do that, then their funding will be jeopardized. We're expecting in probably the next couple of weeks some announcements around that with communities that have been continuing to violate the standards of the executive order in the last 4 months since it was issued. And that will continue over the next year for sure, as there's some amount of lead time for communities to adjust to this new reality. But we expect that the vast majority of communities will simply start enforcing to a greater degree. The fourth part is HUD performance metrics for programs, for Housing First programs in particular, for the continuum of care program. This is where there's trying to reorient how HUD funds programs from a model that is mostly based around just provision of services and provision of housing, offering of housing, to one that is more outcome-oriented. And this is probably the vaguest part of the executive order, and where states are going to have the most flexibility to implement it. What are the outcomes that Utah cares about? That's what this is going after, is empowering Utah to set its priorities and then have that mirrored in the continuum of care program through HUD. And there's some data systems that will have to be upgraded and changed and reoriented towards outcome-based metrics. So this is one that I think will take probably the longest to implement. It's not the easiest policy change. It's one that will be iterative. As communities implement these various changes, they're going to have to respond to HUD and say what's working, what's not. But it's one that we're also very excited about because it actually can do a lot in fixing the bad incentives that have plagued the HUD continuum of care program for too long. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm going to keep going for a second. I want to end on a note of compromise, of cooperation. When we saw the executive order, as an organization that had been working towards it for more than half a decade, we were very excited. But a lot of organizations were very, very concerned. However, despite the rhetoric of the National Homelessness Law Center, which Utahns who didn't know that organization got a nice dose of how they talk about this issue in the New York Times article. I believe there was a comparison to a concentration camp. The National Alliance to End Homelessness is another one that also indulges in excessive rhetoric and tended to fan the flames, in large part because these organizations benefit from division. They benefit when there's a 5-alarm fire. They're not in the business of compromise. But one of their usual compatriots, Mark Horvath, who runs Invisible People, which is a sort of grassroots activist group that promotes storytelling among the homeless and has been a huge critic of mine and my organization, he actually released a podcast about a month after the executive order that I thought struck a much more conciliatory tone than I was expecting. And he made 4 points that I'll go through quickly. The first was that Housing First was implemented poorly, that in fact most programs did not have fidelity to their model of voluntary housing with wraparound services, and too often they became housing only. He even spoke about accrediting these programs, which was something that 6 years ago Cicero originally proposed. The second was that harm reduction, while important, has neglected its impact on communities around it. And that it went from sort of a meeting people where they're at to one where it's actually just leaving them there and then telling communities that are suffering because of harm reduction, because of needles in their parks, that actually, they're blowing it out of proportion. So they admitted that. The third was that there were people that Mark had worked with for over a decade on the street that remained on the street, and that Housing First had failed them, and that in fact involuntary treatment was perhaps the only way to save their life. And the fourth was that the rhetoric of the national homelessness organizations, the two that I mentioned earlier, is totally out of touch with the American public. And that the central reason why this executive order happened, why 40% of the country has been adopting the policies that our organization's been promoting, is because the rhetoric that we're using is actually far more in line with how the public thinks about this issue, with what they want to see happen. And that the simple mantra that housing is a human right helps no one when it leaves people to die on the street. So I'm actually optimistic that if someone like Mark Horvath, who again is no friend of mine, is no supporter of mine, can speak so conciliatorily towards our ideas and actually find plenty of room for compromise there. If we had agreed on those 4 things 5 or 6 years ago, I think we would have been in a very different situation than we are today. So I'm optimistic. And as we go forward, and I think Utah is in a very, very strong position, despite, I think, what we saw in the aftermath of that New York Times piece, where suddenly this became a red versus blue issue. I'm hoping we can return to what Horvath was talking about and actually find a way forward that is bipartisan, that brings people together, and ultimately shows that a state like Utah can lead the way on this issue. Thank you. Do you have a few minutes for questions?
Yeah, that'd be great. We've got about 10 minutes. Sure. Thank you.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I will.
We went through a long period of time where camping was sort of, like you said, we turned a blind eye to it, or it wasn't enforced. And then the courts came along and said, you can enforce. And so I guess my first reaction to all that is, where do these people go? And what has happened since those anti-camping ordinances have been enforced? Where are we on that issue?
Sure. So the question was around the issue of street camping and the change in the courts to allow street camping and then where people go when those things are enacted. Well, I think the first thing, and I want to discuss briefly the courts, because the Ninth Circuit decision in Martin v. Boise had no effect on Utah, had no effect in any of the states where the Cicero Institute worked. And yet there was this learned helplessness in many communities about it. And communities that had nothing to do with the Ninth Circuit were under no federal court decree, decided to just follow along until last year the Supreme Court in Grants Pass overturned that. But I think there's a parallel here with civil commitment as well, where communities have simply adopted an even more narrow interpretation of key legal judgments that have actually prevented their community from making full use of the legal system to be a part of the solution. And it's important to say a part of the solution, not the only solution. I think this is something that gets lost in some of the more conservative states that I work in, that camping bans don't end homelessness, but they're a crucial component of the solution. If you don't have that push and that consequence, most people will just turn down your offer when they're living on the street. Now, that's different from the sheltered homeless population, who tend to cycle through at a relatively fast pace or trying to get out of that situation. For those who live on the street, it's a very different situation. You have much higher rates of chronic homelessness. For them, the rate of successive outreach is usually under 30%, even with persistent offers of housing. So clearly, there's something going on there, and you need to have more of a push. Now, some of this is a lack of capacity, as we talked about before, and some of it is more of a personal orientation towards not wanting to comply with things. To your question, more proper, about what happens when these things are implemented, I would give it as an example, another state that got attention from the New York Times, Kentucky. We worked there with lawmakers on the camping ban there, and there's about 1,700 people living on the street in Kentucky. And the New York Times wrote a piece, sort of a bizarre piece, actually, about camping. And it was relatively balanced, but there was a bit of a view that the camping ordinance was this, shadow over the homeless population, and that it was going to be a negative thing for them. And yet in the article, it discusses this woman who the outreach worker is expressing fear over her being arrested under the camping ban. And in the same breath, it's discussing how this woman is afraid of being eaten by rats. She's had her legs amputated due to sepsis, and she's living outside. For me, that crystallizes the issue here. We're going to say that in its most extreme form, that jail is worse than getting eaten by rats. I just reject that outright. But the reality is that of 1,700 people living outside, only 255 of them were cited by law enforcement, and only 5 of them ended up in jail only after repeated refusals to comply. When you start to look at the unsheltered community, it's a very different situation than the sheltered. The makeup of that is very different in terms of previous legal involvement, in terms of involvement in the sex offender registry. So it's not as simple as you have a camping ban and homelessness goes away. What you need to have, what you can't have, rather, is law enforcement cut out of the solution. That's when things fail. That's when you become San Francisco. When law enforcement is told, this is no longer your issue, and instead we're only going to rely on voluntary outreach.
Thank you. I think we've got time for about 2 more questions, so we'll do this, and then Steve.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity here. We all seem to form this conversation in ways that fit our personal agendas and perspectives. And from my experience in working with the homeless in Salt Lake City and engaging 4 or 5 days a week with that community for a number of years, I found through surveys that the population you're talking about, every one of them, and this is extensive surveys, is dealing with a mental health or addiction problem. And that woman or the person that was being eaten by the rats had been in jail 10 times already, and has probably been in 3 addiction programs and detox 10 times, and in 7 mental health programs since the age of 12 years old. And you're suggesting that putting her back in the same system and putting her in jail rather than leaving her on the street is going to solve the problem. To me, there's a big disconnect between how you're seeing the problem and your solution to the problem, which is putting her in jail so she can get the help that she's already had at least 10 times in the past that didn't help her. So I don't see the logic or the evidence. The evidence is the key. A data-driven discussion on are those programs you or the system wants to put her in actually going to help her? Or are we just going in circles? Thank you.
So I believe the question there was around whether or not the alternative services are in fact empirically better than what we're doing now, perhaps? So I struggle with this because I think that when we talk about empiricism, what are we measuring? What do we care about? And let's start with mortality. So the Urban Institute did a study of a Housing First project in Denver, randomized control trial, perhaps the best study of Housing First ever. Fairly recent, about 4 years ago. And I was there at their presentation of it at the American Society of Criminology. I've met with their evaluators. I can't for the life of me figure out how they wrote this report. So they called it a huge success. People that were offered the Housing First option had higher rates of retained housing compared to the other group. Except buried in the appendix was a chart that showed that they had a 50% higher death rate. And that got one line in the main report that said, well, it's a tricky population. They die a lot. And it was outrageous to me that they blew past the worst outcome possible, people dying in your program, as an irrelevant metric out of this ideological focus on housing. We then look at the situation with that woman living on the street. We look at mortality rates of unsheltered versus sheltered homeless. A study from the NIH funded a study in Boston, sheltered versus unsheltered, 2.5 times the mortality rate if you live outside versus if you're in a shelter. Okay, so we want people to be in shelter, not unsheltered. Housing First, has some mortality issues. What about prisons? What about the worst case scenario? I don't want people to go to prison. I don't want people to go to jail. I think we have to have the threat of that in order for people to comply at the margins. But let's say they all, some number of them do go. Well, prison has 1/10 of the mortality rate of homelessness. So we're talking about the most extreme outcome. If we're going to measure this, what are we going for? Well, at mortality, we're saving lives. Now, we have to have a whole spectrum of institutions, a whole spectrum of programs. We can't just rely on the most extreme option, also one of the most expensive options. But we have to accept that at the margins, with the most extreme people, the people who are in the highest need, we have to be talking about saving lives. And what we're doing right now is not doing that. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we just have time for one more
Okay,
question.
thank you very much, Gus. This was an amazing presentation, and your research and the way you lead in this is helping all of us, especially here from Utah. So I have a question for you. So after the grants passed decision, that really talked about unsanctioned camping, so a tent in the city. You've mentioned the crack house ordinances from
Yes.
the 1980s, but there's something in between, and we live with it every single day. And you don't see it unless you're around it. So, for example, the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake City or in depopulated areas throughout the country, we have it in Boise, we have it in Albuquerque, we have it in Vegas. When a motorhome comes and sets up, it's somewhere between a tent and Section 8 housing. And to an outsider, if you're on the street, it looks like that is housing. But really what that is a pawn shop. Really what that is a chop house. Really what that is drug distribution. So we will sit in a parking lot, and especially if there are 4 or 5 that land up in a row. So we have 600 street light poles in the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake City. They're welded shut. Because if they're not welded shut, that copper wire will be stolen tonight. And so in and around these motor homes or mobile homes or campers, which we think is another level of housing, those actually have a GDP. Those actually create commerce. You can see things happening in and out. You can see truckers pull up. If there's a small contractor in the northwest quadrant of Salt Lake City, his tools are stolen that moment. So he walks into a building, his compressor, paint sprayer, small welder, whatever it is, they go in and out of those. So there's a new type of commerce. So with your work and the work that is happening across the country, how do we address these motorhomes and mobile homes and campers which look like they're housing, but in truer commerce centers? They're the pawn shop of today.
So the question was around the issue of campers and motorhomes and their impact on public safety and what to do about them. So it's something that came up in Boise, actually, ironically, the center of Martin v. Boise, which Grants Pass had to overturn for the Ninth Circuit. The issue is complicated, but it ultimately, we can't think of unauthorized parking and living out of a mobile vehicle, whether it is a camper or a car. I had a man actually living in front of my house in a car fairly recently. I'll come back to that. But we can't think of that as an acceptable alternative to camping. That is still camping. And the ordinances that cities must adopt must reflect that. And that can be done through the parking ordinances. I mean, there's ways to approach that. Now, in terms of the direct issue of if people are pawning goods and stealing goods, I mean, you have to enforce that. And this is where I think we often struggle with what is, when I was in San Francisco, we had District Attorney Chesa Boudin, who said he was no longer going to enforce quality of life crimes. He framed theft from cars as a quality of life crime, as something that was a crime of survival. I think it is abhorrent to say to poor Americans that we think that you just steal to survive. I think that's BS. I think that you're conflating two populations, a population that is willing to commit crimes and a population that is poor but is going to do their best for themselves and their families to get out of it. Those are different populations. We should treat them differently. So we have to reject the framing of theft as a crime of survival, first and foremost, or as a quality of life crime. And then, in terms of the broader thing with people living in a car, so I had a man about 2 weeks ago whose car broke down next to my house, and my neighbors and I offered to get him into a extended stay hotel for a few nights. And then we attempted to coax him to go to a shelter. He obviously refused. And eventually, after about 6 or 7 days, moved back into the car in front of my house. And each passing day led to another appendage off of the car. It was a small sedan. But soon there was a tarp, soon there were boxes, and I mean, it just accumulated. And eventually we had no choice but to have the vehicle towed. And we spoke with him about it. He knew it was going to happen. He had a place for it to be towed to, a friend's house. And that push was what was necessary to resolve the situation. Not because we wanted to harm him, not because we didn't wish him well. We had just reached the limit of what we could do voluntarily. And I live, over near Westminster University, a pretty progressive neighborhood. I think my neighbors were kind of hoping that I would be the one to take care of the problem. And they all expressed gratitude afterwards. They were like, the situation was getting out of control. It was becoming an encampment in your front lawn. I have the context to understand that people often refuse offers of help repeatedly over and over again. And you have to have some way to push them towards the thing that they need to do to help themselves. But most people don't know that. And it just feels like they're hurting them. It just feels like they're doing wrong. But we have to unlearn that paralysis. We can't continue in that mindset because it doesn't help us, it doesn't help our communities, and it sure as hell does not help the homeless people. Thank you.
Really appreciate your time this afternoon. I failed to mention when I stood up and introduced Devon that he's the Public Safety Policy Director for the Cicero Institute. So again, we appreciate your time. Next, we will have the favorable experience to have updates on legislative and policy updates. And we have 3 guest speakers, and I'll quickly introduce each of them. So we have Representative Carrie Ann Lisenby, And Representative Lisenby, her legislative efforts have spanned a range of issues from healthcare and tax reform to education, opportunity, and economic development. Representative Lisenby passed significant legislation protecting victims and making Utah's communities and schools safe through increasing accountability and transparency in the criminal justice system. Her efforts have been instrumental in advancing Utah's prosperity. She's serving her 5th term representing District 14. So thank you for attending. In addition, Representative Clint Okerlund, he's a freshman legislator representing East Sandy and small part of Cottonwood Heights. He's the CFO of a biotech company and other startups in Sandy. His platform focuses on good governance and fiscal accountability, strengthening education, increasing affordability, addressing homelessness with effective solutions, and working towards maintaining higher water levels in the Great Salt Lake and cleaner air in the valley. And then we also have the fortunate experience to have Nick Coleman. He's the Assistant State Coordinator for the Utah Office of Homeless Services. Nick has been appointed by Governor Spencer Cox to serve as Utah's interim state homeless coordinator beginning December 6th, as a role in which he will advance the governor's homeless priorities during the upcoming legislative session and prepare the Office of Homeless Services for the transition of Representative Tyler Clancy effective March 2016. Coleman is a strong advocate for innovation, accountability, and transparency. So we welcome them all to the stage. And then just as we're getting started, a few of the discussion points we hope to talk about today was impacts of past legislation on public safety and homelessness, updates on current and upcoming bills related to public safety and homelessness, as well as we'll do a brief question and answer. We plan to wrap up the meeting today at 5:30, so we have about 35 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I don't know that I should be going first, but I appreciate this, being here with you all today. But before I share any comments or thoughts, by raise of hands, has anyone served in the armed forces before, currently? Just wanted to take a moment here at the beginning and thank you for your service, especially on Veterans Day.
Real quick, he was the first elected Japanese to the California House of Representatives. So he worked for the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration. He just recently retired.
Well, very good.
Giving community service.
Well, it's my pleasure and honor to be here with you all today. I am Nick Coleman. I'm going to be the interim state coordinator during this upcoming legislative session. Following the retirement of President Wayne Niederhauser, he's here in the audience with us as well, and been just a tremendous honor and pleasure to work alongside Coordinator Niederhauser and in preparation for Coordinator Clancy come March 2026. So at any rate, some of the more notable items that we've spoken about have been, of course, the governor just mentioned last week, his support again for the transformative campus. And we've spoken a lot about that at the Homeless Services Board level, not only on the facilities and infrastructure piece, but more importantly, much more importantly, on the culture piece and what we'd like to do in terms of a treatment-focused approach to this. And so at any rate, that's a very definite priority for us. In addition to, and across the board, we'd really like to emphasize our support for Chief Fred. It's one item that in Devon's presentation, he did not mention. I think a lot of the other pieces are going to be central to the upcoming legislative session. I'll share that when I first came into my position and coming from the governor's office, I moved where I live personally, and I moved by the public safety building, the Salt Lake City Public Library, right downtown. And I told myself that if we did anything in this role that was successful and good, that area would be a little bit easier to walk around and a little safer at night, especially. And I don't want to take any sort of credit. I want to actually credit Chief Red for really just doing a tremendous job, not only in that part of town, but across Salt Lake City as well. So we're going to be taking some measures there. And then lastly, Representative Clancy mentioned last week in a piece in the Utah News Dispatch his desire to see flexibility in funding and the addition of accountability measures in the way we administer our funds. I'd say not only that, but we want to be able to incentivize greater coordination between service providers who are doing some incredible work. But we want to be able to not only have programs that are considerate of themselves, but programs that are considerate of other providers, and to be able to incentivize them to follow an individual across programs, across providers, across the system, to be able to take a person from wherever they are to wherever they're heading. Before I came here, probably like many of you, I was in my apartment, and that is not a bellwether of success for me in a day. A bellwether of success for me in a day is knowing my neighbor, is being able to provide for somebody when I see they need assistance, for having faith and family and community, and being connected to all of you in this space as well. These are important outcomes of my own life, and important outcomes I think that we want to be able to incentivize for others, and to help them reach them. So anyway, those are just a couple thoughts that I'd had.
It's great to be with you here today, and I agree. Thank you for your service, all of our veterans here today. So I thought maybe I would focus just a little bit on past legislation and direction, and then kind of where we're headed. And I know Clint can fill in, or Representative Okerlund can fill in a lot of the gaps. But just a broad overview, about 10 years ago, the Utah legislature passed what's called justice reform. And it decriminalized pretty much every drug crime that there was. And that is when we saw the change in our neighborhoods and our communities, with more and more individuals on the streets, because there wasn't accountability in the system. There are a lot of people who were getting help through the system prior to this because you had a felony charge, but if you went through drug court successfully, it was lowered to a misdemeanor charge. And that was a carrot. That was an incentive, and it was successful for a lot of people. And we heard testimony at the time, please don't do this. Please don't decriminalize these crimes, because this worked for me. This is the only thing that worked for me. And so, and it resonated what Mr. Kurtz said about, there are a lot of poor people that don't commit crimes. And it's a shame to conflate those two populations, those who do and those who don't. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about that we've done just recently in Utah is we've created a really great working relationship with Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County and the legislature. And so I passed a bill last session in conjunction with working with Mayor Wilson and with the county council to increase jail capacity. And that was really important because we saw that it was a revolving door. And not only was it a revolving door, when you shone a light on it, it was a revolving door for many dangerous felons who were getting released. They were booked and released within a few hours and back out on the streets. Law enforcement was rearresting them 10, 20, 30 times. We also found in a previous year, I worked on felony cases in that space of repeat offenders, and there were about 280 people that in the previous 5 years had committed 8,000 felonies. Do the math there. That's a problem, right? That shows that there's a lack of accountability in the system. And so we inserted accountability back in the system. We also are on the forefront of any state in the union on our data collection, data reporting in the criminal justice space. And this is important because it helps us actually get further down the road on our policy goals. We have to have data. We have to see what's working and what isn't so that we can move forward. And then the last thing is our work on reentry. So we've actually worked on making a smooth landing for people who have been incarcerated, who are now re-entering their communities. How can we help them? I passed a bill that made sure that they were getting their identification, their birth certificate, their driver's license, whatever identification they could get at least 30 days prior to their release from prison, so that when they were released, they didn't have to go through the bureaucratic nightmare of trying to get identification. I don't know if you've ever done that, but it's a pain. So we wanted to make sure that we were helping people get a good start. We've also funded a lot of community correction centers where people can go, they can have their job, and then they can come back at night and report back in and transition slowly back into the community and adjust to having the freedom that they aren't used to having after being incarcerated for a long time. So those are some big efforts that you've seen as we've been trying to swing the pendulum back to the middle. It is not the Utah legislature's goal to swing the pendulum all the way back to soft on crime back to tough on crime policies, right? There is a really happy medium that in Utah we are trying to find so that we don't see those large pendulum swings. Instead, we have a justice system that is funded and working for the people in the community who do not want to be victims of crime and who do not want to see crime happening on their streets as they're driving by with their children going to school, but also those people who are committing the crimes, to hold them accountable and to help them to refocus their lives. And so that's just a broad overview, and I'm also happy to answer any questions after this, but I'll let Representative Okerlund go.
Hi, I'm Clint Okerlund, and part of the reason I decided to get involved in politics lately is because I saw the great work that Wayne Niederhauser was doing, who's a neighbor and a role model for me, and I think he's a big part of the reason that I threw my hat in the ring a while back. What I wasn't told when I started the legislative session was how much food is always available to you at all times. And despite weighing the same amount, almost to the pound, for most of my adult life, I gained 10 pounds in 45 days. And the reason I bring this up is because I wanted to lose that weight. My knees were starting to hurt now that I was heavier stuff, and so I cut back on my calories. But what that did was my metabolism slowed down. So I said, well, I need to start exercising more. But exercising more made me hungrier. And it was this big problem of moving parts and changing variables. And as I look at what it's like to come in from not having experience, I think most people in this room have a wealth of experience trying to work on solutions to solve homelessness. I do not have that. But what I see is a similar problem where when you try to turn one knob, the other one turns the other direction, and when you pull one lever, the other one goes up, and it's this complex system of mental illness and drug dependency and violence and sickness and crime and in the meantime, we're all trying to do what we think is most compassionate. And it's been really interesting as a lawmaker, the thing that I've learned most so far in this journey is that there's nothing more dangerous than a lawmaker who doesn't know that they don't know what they don't know. And I hope that's not me. I think I do know that I don't know what I don't know. And that's and for me, trying to get involved in solving homelessness has been interesting to view myself as an experiment of what am I learning? And if I listen to all sides as somebody who doesn't know anything, where do I come out? What do I think are the solutions on this? And it's interesting to hear different people with entirely different philosophies have a different image of what compassion looks like. What does compassion look like to somebody who's got an urgent need? And how do we turn urgent needs into urgent solutions that lead to long-term solutions that lead to reintegration into becoming healthy, valuable, contributing members of society? And these are all questions where the levers and the knobs are turning in opposite directions seemingly, and if I find out the answer, I will let you know. But I love the fact that we're all here, and I know we probably don't all agree on what the right calibration is. But that's the value of being together today, is that we can have these conversations, and interestingly, maybe even find out that there's common ground that we weren't expecting. One of the things that I've talked about with Representative Clancy is this problem of some people think the goalpost is over here, and some people think the goalpost is over here, and how do you reconcile which direction we can we all grab the ball together and do a big bush push towards one end zone and agree that this is that moving in the same direction is more valuable than and fighting homelessness is more important than fighting amongst ourselves. These are questions that I hope to find the answers to. Now, where do we stand on legislation for this upcoming year? Honestly, I don't think those answers are going to be revealed until after next week, when the interim session ends and we start having our caucus meetings to let each other know what the legislation is that we're working on. I don't have anything in particular that comports to this particular topic, but I do have one thing that if you think it's valuable and you'll support me on this, talk to your representative and let them know that this is an idea you support. If not, just be quiet and don't say anything to them. But I had this experience one time through the legislative session where what I saw was 959 bills introduced. They were drafted. They had a fiscal analyst, they had a policy analyst, they had a drafting attorney. In many cases, these went out to other stakeholders around the state, agency heads, saying, what would this do to your agency? How would you respond to this? How do you feel about this? Going out to lobbyist groups and special interests, and a lot of time and energy. Well, guess what? We, almost 250 of those bills, in which we spent a lot of money and time and resources, they never saw the light of day because it's a 45-day session and we ran out of time. One of the things that I'd like to propose is a limit on the number of bills that representatives and senators can even number and introduce, so that when the last week comes around, we're not suspending the rules. And what are the rules that we suspend? These are what the rules are supposed to be, that you should have a hearing in the Senate, you should have a hearing in the House committee, you should have public input on all of these laws, and you should have time to read those changes before you have to vote on them in your chamber. And 65% of the 582 bills that we passed were passed in the last week, most of those while under suspension of the rules. What that means is we probably passed a lot of rules, laws that will require cleanup because they didn't get the analysis that they needed, and we'll have more bills next year and then the next year. So I'm proposing that we limit that down about 300 bills, and if you'll talk to the reason I bring this up now isn't just because I like to tell my platform on this. I think it's a way for us to prioritize what's actually important to legislators, what's actually important to your constituents, and it gets rid of messaging bills, and it gets rid of performative legislation, and it helps us focus on things like this that will be most important. And if I don't get support on this, then it turns out I was the one running a performative legislation, and I don't want to be a hypocrite. So I think we're going to open. Anyway, thank you for that. But I think I'm out of interesting things to say, so I'm going to sit down and let these guys answer questions. Oh, I do want to say I'm so glad Nick is here, because probably 15 times in the last 6 months I've been called by Tyler Clancy to say, I'm not able to attend this thing that they asked me to attend. Would you be my backup? And this is the first time I'm not the Timu Tyler Clancy. Nick gets to be his replacement this time. So anyway, thank you.
15 minutes for questions and answers. We'll wrap up at 5:30. So who had a question back here? Perfect.
So this was brought up during Mr. Kurtz's comments, but I did want to bring it up as far as COC PSH funding being potentially shifted around. There's around 900 households that are currently housed in Salt Lake County's COC through permanent supportive housing funding. If that is cut, how does the state of Utah plan on continuing to support these households that 94% of them have been successful in that housing for at least 5 years?
Well, thanks. So I don't want to presume to speak for Mr. Kurtz. However, I will say that he did address this in his remarks, and I think the answer was right. I haven't heard so far anyone talk about a cut to COC PSH funding or just COC funding whatsoever. What I've heard is some pretty well-intentioned discussions from a state leadership perspective and in coordination with some local leaders as well, to say, look, we have 3 COCs right now in our state. There's balance of state, which largely accounts for our rural areas of Utah. There's Mountainland, which takes care of a couple counties, and then there's Salt Lake County alone. I'll share that I have a little bit of personal worry about a transformative campus in the context that only Salt Lake County would be able to have to coordinate with itself in that COC structure. And so I do think it's interesting time right now for the federal government to say, hey, look, maybe states should be able to more flexibly apply some of these dollars, and to be able to think about how they're going to be able to utilize federal funding. But that being said, these are 2 distinct issues. I mean, I think PSH units, permanent supportive housing units, for those who aren't aware of the acronym, are important, and they serve an important function within our overall system. And so, echoing what Representative Clancy said the other day, there has been a discussion about what might happen with federal funding in sort of a block grant format. But it's also not about reducing capacity. It's about being able to say, for our current providers and for our current apartment units and our current PSH units, can we ask for different outcome measures for those units themselves? But this heightened rhetoric about transferring the funding from one place to the other and leaving these units without any sort of funding, I think is premature, and it presupposes that members of our legislature and state leadership won't have a really informed and well-intentioned dialogue. And so I'll share, there is no sort of grand plan mystery thing in the background that is about taking away money for the 900 units. It's really more, how do we just drive some better outcomes and be able to measure that? And that's really where that discussion stems from.
Thank you. Other questions?
For the campus one, we probably the 2 representatives might know, is that something that is being discussed about what happens to the campus?
Whether funding is being discussed about.
Here you go, Scott.
Some maybe legislative thoughts about that.
That is above both of our pay grades. I will tell you that, oh yes, the question was about funding for the campus, the new campus. So I will say that we are staring down the barrel of some pretty, a pretty tight budget year. And so, but again, Utah has prioritized over the past several years, making sure that we are taking care of homelessness issues and funding. And so I'm not going to be premature and say that I know if there's funding or where the funding will come from, but I believe that the Utah legislature will act in good faith to make sure that if it's not funded in 1 year, maybe it's funded in 2. We're really quite creative when it comes to funding things sometimes.
Thank you. This has been informative. When you talk about collecting data and the new campus model, and I was just over on 33rd South this morning or this afternoon, and there was a big new fancy Huntsman mental health facility there. There was a homeless shelter right there, and there was a police station right there, all within a block of each other. It sounded like that there was already a campus in place, or a model that outlined what a future campus is going to look like. My question is, before you build a new one, would it be wise to start collecting data on the effectiveness of the programs and what you're doing there before you committed large sums of money to something new? And if you collected data from the Huntsman Institute and the shelters and all the process, it might guide you in your decision-making process moving forward and if you find it successful, you might be easier to find money. If you don't, well, then you might be saving money because you're just producing the failure. So just a suggestion. Thank you.
I just think that's a great comment. And as I've tried to get myself more and more involved in homelessness issues, I find that data collection is really one of the issues that we struggle with. And sometimes just because you have data doesn't mean it's good data. And so I think that's an excellent suggestion. And I have said that about numerous programs, which is prove it works, and then and then it becomes an easier sell. There's a lot of things the legislature's asked to fund that has not been, that hasn't been proven out in this area and others. And I think you're spot on. I would support that.
All right, well, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you. So on behalf of Solutions Utah, thank you to Devon for his being here with us and his comments, and our two representatives. We're deeply grateful, and Nick. And on behalf of Solutions Utah, I think we also want to thank Wayne Niederhauser for his long-tenured public service, including as coordinator of the homelessness effort in the state of Utah. So Wayne, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Just a couple of thoughts in closing. So Solutions Utah, just say we're strictly a voluntary group. We don't get paid. We're just some volunteers, trying to do some good things. And we realize there are smarter people than us, so we invite them to come and be an important voice in our community. We'll continue that effort to try to bring them. We're starting to look forward to our annual conference. It'll be in the spring. And we're working on bringing in some very powerful people there as well. We will look forward to that event. So we will continue to be a voice. We'll make suggestions. We'll offer our opinion on things that we think are important, especially around the issue of homelessness. And one of the things I think is important for us to know, we try to get information from a lot of places. There are a lot of good organizations around the country doing good things. But I would tell you, in my personal opinion, I think the Solutions Utah board would agree with me. I'm not sure there are better organizations anywhere in the country than we have here, with organizations like the Other Side Academy, the Other Side Village, and Switchpoint. And there's so much to be learned from their models. The one thing about their models, and there might be critics of some of the things about that, but we can work with that and enhance that. But they have proven to be able to have positive outcomes. And in the case of the Other Side Academy in particular, most of those people have been pushed there. We've used the word push. I love that word. There's a push to get there. And some people don't like the fact that people get pushed toward these kinds of facilities. But I've visited with many of the students over at the Other Side Academy, and I've yet to find one that complains about the fact they were put there. They are ecstatic about the changes in their lives that have taken place because somebody pushed them out of a lifestyle that they couldn't get out of on their own, but they've now successfully been able to get out of with the right kinds of help. And I think, our view is, if we can get the state campus model modeled after these kinds of programs on a grander scale, to where it's not somewhere we're just putting people. And that's been voiced, in the media. That's not the view of I think what the campus model is all about. It will be transformative, just as it is with these other programs. And we commend the state. I know they've been getting a lot of input from those organizations and getting counsel. And so we encourage us all, and the legislative group, and Nick and his group, and eventually Representative Clancy, as he takes on his new role, to really, really get the voices of those organizations that are successful, and probably as successful as any organizations anywhere in the country. Anyway, again, we thank you for being with us tonight. We're grateful for that, and grateful again to our speakers. Big round of applause to them one more time. I don't know that anybody's here from Grand America, but we thank them once again for hosting us this evening. We hope you have a nice evening. Thank you.